So this map shows the study area. Darker areas represent a greater percentage of population growth between 2020 and 2050. The lighter ones are a smaller percentage. So as you see, it doesn't mean that Harris County is growing. What it's saying is there's already a large population here. It's hard to move that needle. What you continue to see is that large amount of growth in the suburban areas that are just now catching up on development. So you see that in Montgomery County, farther out in Fort Bend, also in the near portions of Liberty and Chambers counties as well. Actually, even a few small declines in population in southern Brazoria County, where we're already actually seeing that from the census data. That's anticipated over time as well. But there's still a large amount of growth in that urban core, as you might expect. And so that shows the information by census tract. Once we have that population data, we're able to then project out future demand. That's based on a per capita or a per person demand. Applying that demand to the population ultimately gives you the demands that we're looking at. And so you see similar trends there. This is presented in MGD. Again, Harris County far and away outweighs the other demands. Of course, Fort Bend and Brazoria counties are up there, Montgomery County as well. So again, several counties that have a significant water demand in this area, in addition to just Harris-Galveston. And so all that information that you saw on that map, again, was presented at the census tract level. I want to make it very clear that although this information is presented at a very high level, it was really looked at an extreme level of detail down to the utility. And what that took is taking the population projections that came out of the model on a tract basis, take that down to census blocks. So allocating out on a land use basis where that population growth is actually going to occur, and then organizing that into the present and future utility boundaries that may exist. Once we're able to get to that utility level, that meant that in the study we could look at utility level per capita use. So if a utility were using more water on average, then that population was allocated a greater amount of water demand than one that has a lower per capita use. So that was done at a very detailed level and then rolled up to those more regional totals. And what that results in is something like the map you see here. So as you can see, the high demand areas, and this is just pretty much a relative basis here. You have darker areas that don't really represent that much demand, especially in some of these that aren't developable. And of course, the bright yellow ones here that are screaming at your eyes right now, that's where that large amount of water demand is in the future. So again, we're just looking at municipal demands right now. We'll talk a little bit about other uses in just a moment, but you can see that pretty much tracks with what you would expect population growth would look like in the area. And so this is a quick snapshot at 2050. And this information was compiled all the way through out to 2100 on the full range of the study. So also non-municipal demands are a very key user of water in the region as well. So for industrial and mining uses, that data was actually adapted from information compiled by the Texas Water Development Board. That information is a little bit difficult to study. You can imagine you can't go to many industries and just ask them what they think their water use is going to be in the next 20 or 30 years. It's proprietary information. It's driven by market conditions. It's pretty much impossible to really narrow down. But what this gives us is a very high level data set regionally that we can use, but also modify that based on our own understanding of groundwater versus surface water and alternative water uses. And that information came primarily from y'all's data sources. Agricultural information, that's irrigation and livestock. That's information that was compiled largely from resources that y'all provided. So we're able to use that information and generally leveled out that use over time. So not expecting growth. Actually, out in Fort Bend County, continuing to expect a decline in that. Some consideration was given to not just the historical trends, but also the change in land use as that population increased. So all together, brought together that information to combine with the municipal use to get a total picture of what overall water demand was. And so from there was the ability to take that demand, translate it to a groundwater-based demand that could be fed into John's models. And you'll see, as he talks about that, what those different scenarios entail. The next part of this was the investigation of alternative water supplies. And as you know, if you are reducing groundwater use, there has to be something that steps in to replace that. Historically in the region, that's been surface water. What this was intended to do is an effort by Subsidence to take a fresh look at what potential alternative supplies could be and really assess what's the availability in the region, which options rose to the top, and just how diverse is the potential future water portfolio. So starting out, once you really start to put paper to pen here and try to estimate just how many options there are out there, we're actually blessed with a very large range of options within this region. We're very fortunate in that way. And it came out to something over 20 different options that could be considered for developing alternative water supplies. So that's good information. But where the study was focused in was on these 7 options as the primary options for water supply. That included surface water development, which has been key historically, seawater desalination, centralized reclaimed water treatment options, decentralized reuse options. And so these are reuse facilities, smaller reuse facilities that are distributed around the utility. Brackish groundwater desalination, aquifer storage and recovery, and demand management, or typically conservation as we describe it. And so Subsidence went through an effort to look at each one of these different options, provide a description of what that entailed, estimate the magnitude of the projects, develop costs for what they might run for project development, the timelines associated with them, and then also consider what vulnerability they might have to climate change. And so this is a quick view of estimated costs. Obviously, these vary quite a bit. You see some, more obvious trends. Potable reuse is up there, just like seawater desal is. Those are projects that we typically expect to have a higher cost than some of the other alternatives. But I think just as interesting here, the range on these costs can vary just as much as within these strategies as they do across the strategies. So it's very important to keep in mind that project costs are going to be specific to the individual utility, the magnitude of that application, and just where they are being developed within the region. Also, implementation timelines are key as well. What y'all have done with your regulatory plan is give a very long-term view for our water users within the region of when they need to convert. But it's good to also know kind of what the timelines look like for the planning, permitting, and development of these projects to make sure that they fit within that. And so, again, you can see, just as we see a variety of ranges in costs, we see a variety of timelines for implementing some of these projects, with projects like desal taking a much longer time than, say, demand management. They can be turned around pretty quickly. So looking at this, once they concluded their analysis, they estimated somewhere on the range of just over 1.8 billion gallons per day of water that could be developed within the region pretty easily and provided for alternative water supplies. And what this really indicates is the ability to meet the needs of current regulatory plan as it sits and provide options for how these projects might be implemented in the future, that utilities aren't locked into any particular alternative. So to conclude, there are adequate water supplies, according to this study. Surface water is still likely to be a very key resource going on in the future. So that has been historically a strong alternative water supply. It probably will continue to be that way. So again, we're very fortunate as a region to have that as an option. Reclaim will also be a key resource as well. And on some of these bigger projects, as you might guess, desal, interbasin transfers, there's going to be a need for regional cooperation on implementing those projects. And we've already seen that as we look at the ways that the City of Houston, the regional water authorities have worked together historically to deliver some of these large infrastructure projects. And so with that, I'm going to pass this over to John here to talk about some of the exciting stuff on the modeling side of this. This basically translates the future need to what that actually represents from a subsidence standpoint.
Thanks, Jason. So as Jason mentioned, I'm here to talk about the parts task C and D of the Joint Plan Regulatory Review. And I am John Ellis with Intera. And first, I wanted to thank everybody here on the board for funding this part of the project, particularly the Gulf Coast Land Subsidence Groundwater Flow Model, i.e. Gulf 2023. That effort was initiated in October 2019. That was a 3-year effort to update the Houston area groundwater model to replace it as the model of record for the northern Texas Gulf Coast. We then used that tool to run a variety of scenarios on that model, simulate a variety of future conditions that are looked at here in Harris County and Galveston County. So I did make a presentation to the board on the Gulf model of this board in March of last year, so I won't take a ton of time to step through all of it all over again there, but just as a brief recap, it is calibrated, it's a groundwater flow model, it's calibrated to 115 years of land subsidence and water level data from 1906 to 2018. And there were a lot of updates in this model from the previous model. It's a new modeling code, new land subsidence package, redone recharge, layering water use, groundwater level targets. The entire thing was pretty much redone from the ground up, just keeping the conceptualization from the previous model. So we made it the most available, best available science for the northern part of the Gulf Coast aquifer. And the model was released in January of 2023. And it was blessed by TWDD as a GAM a year later, more or less, in February of 2024, after they determined it represented the best available science for the aquifer system. So again, as a recap, it's the current model of record in GMA 14 area and the Houston area. And if you want to see a copy of the report documenting the model, it's available there on the QR code of the model. One of the items we wanted to look at with this evaluation of subsidence in Harris County, Galveston County is looking at how does the new model compare to the previous models you've used for subsidence. And in this case, you have that press model, the press code. And those press models, they've been around for a long time. They provide localized simulations of land subsidence. Now I'm going to note here that we, in doing this comparison, are comparing a 3D groundwater model that simulates more regional to semi-regional scale subsidence to a localized subsidence model, which are again are the press models. So they're very different tools regarding the spatial scale and the functionings of the code, each code under the hood. Okay. So the press site, it simulates subsidence at 26 sites across the greater Houston area. Most of those sites are about 7 square miles in size, the largest of which go up to about 21 square miles. So I mentioned that because, again, they are small size, again, compared to the regional tool we're using here, the Gulf model. So these charts show you the simulated subsidence in the Gulf model, which is a little hard to see, but it is the dashed yellow line as the Gulf model. The press model is the line in black. Okay? So this shows you 4 sites on this slide, and I'll show you 4 more on the next slide. This just kind of gives you a snapshot of 8 of the 26 sites. So 8 of the 26 sites. You can get an idea of roughly what do the trends look like when you compare one tool to the next. So if you look at that top left slide there, the top left of the slide, you see the Crosby site up here. Overall, had a pretty good fit between those two tools. Cypress Creek, again, same thing. If you look at the observed and simulated subsidence there, the subsidence being on the y-axis, time being on the x-axis, overall the lines overlay pretty well. So again, provides confidence in the modeling tool. If you look at downtown, again, we see a little bit of divergence in the later years, but again, overall it looks fairly good. If you look at the Eagle Point site, there was a few issues there. That's in eastern Galveston County, a little bit of discrepancies between the Gulf and the press models. In the Gulf model, I didn't really have any benchmarks that site calibrated to. They were about 10 miles to the west, up and down I-45 in Galveston County, which, I mean, in those areas, the Gulf model actually hits the calibration targets very well, but this is 10 miles to the east, so just more or less we had a bit of a lack of data at this site. So again, those observed simulated trends are a little bit different between these two models. And if you look at the rest of the models here, the Harrisburg site, Hobby, Humboldt, and then Katy, overall you see a pretty good trend, again, considering that one of these is a regional scale model and the other is a localized compaction model. So more or less, this did provide confidence in our model results using the Gulf model, comparing it to the tool that's been used here for subsidence for many years, which is Press. Okay, the next piece of this is to look at some scenarios now and just kind of talk through which of those scenarios represent, so you get an idea of what future projected subsidence looks like here under a variety of situations. So on the screen here from left, these are the 4 scenarios that we ran on this model, selected among a number of other scenarios. We have the baseline scenario, the maximum allowable, the drought, and the 5-year delay scenarios. So that first scenario on the left, that baseline scenario, it kind of answers the question of what subsidence do we expect to occur if the existing regulatory plan is maintained? Or if you put it another way, what subsidence do we expect to occur if the same groundwater use patterns continue? So the baseline scenario assumes a constant per capita demand for each of the municipal or domestic water users over the planning horizon. And it represents kind of expected per capita demand for that specific user under typical climate conditions. So the change in groundwater demand over time in the baseline is basically driven by long-term growth, okay? Or in some cases, you could say decline in some areas. And again, in population, or the anticipated growth or decline in non-municipal demand. And then also the regulated deadlines for conversion to reduce groundwater use, okay? So this scenario incorporates expected groundwater use and again, the degree to which users are likely to remain on groundwater, okay? Now I'm gonna note here that, for example, in regulatory area 1, the actual use of groundwater is closer to 3% of total water demand versus the regulatory amount can be up to 10%. So this scenario assumes that the users that have historically over-converted are going to continue to use that amount, okay? So again, if you have 3% currently getting used, that's what this scenario simulates. The next scenario, the maximum allowable scenario, takes it all the way up, that number all the way up to the maximum regulatory amount. So again, if you go back to that example from Galveston County, the scenario simulates the full 10% allowed under the regulatory plan. And then we also have the drought scenario, which is the third one. And this simulates, what answers the question, what subsidence occurs if groundwater use over time varies in response to a drought? I mean, we know that typically when we have drought conditions, water levels are going to decrease due to increase in pumping. So even though overall use over a longer time frame may be similar, during those drought years, you may have increase in pumping, which will derive effectively more subsidence. So I'm going to note that that scenario, that drought scenario, does not change the total long-term pumping compared to that baseline scenario. But what it does is the pumping is varied over 10-year cycles to reflect simulated wet and dry conditions. And then the last one is the 5-year delay, which is that P21 scenario, and that just answers the question, what happens if you relax your conversion timeline in the regulatory plan? So the delay conversions are for North Harris County, Central, and West Harris County, and the portions of the city of Houston JRPR, okay? And then additionally, North Harris County Regional is delayed an additional 5 years because of assumed credit usage. So most of those pumping adjustments for this scenario, for that 5-year delay scenario here, is in area 3. Okay? So I know that's a lot of words, but I want to just give you the baseline of what you're looking at in each of these scenarios, and we'll link into them now that you're about to look at the results. So these are the baseline results from 2025 to 2050. Okay, so we do the scenario over a 25-year planning timeline. We started in 2025 and this year, and part of that is because the model ends in 2018, we kind of have a bridge between the end of the model simulated water use and the demand use that begins in 2025. Between 2018 and 2025, we kind of ramp up to that use. So if you look at across, most of Fort Bend, Harris County, and Galveston County, you see subsidence is less than about half a foot here in Harris and here in Galveston counties. Far northern Harris County, there is more subsidence to the north. You can see those contour lines start to get much closer together. And again, this is based on the current use with the expected use built in, not the maximum regulatory So again,
John, just to be clear, this one is if everybody follows the regulatory plan like it is right.
correct. As of right now, if you follow the plan. So there is a good bit more subsidence in the north, there in Montgomery County that does move into Harris County over that 25-year timeline. I did want to note as part of this plan, the utilities in Montgomery County, they use a blend of groundwater and surface water. So in the baseline scenario, the groundwater demand increases over time for those entities based on the assumption they will continue to use approximately the same split between surface water and groundwater that they're using right now. Okay. So if you look at those results again, you're seeing overall half a quarter of a foot to half of a foot of subsidence increase following your current regulatory plan 320. Okay, so we'll move on to the maximum allowable scenario. And again, this assumes that users that have over-converted will instead use their maximum amount of pumping that they are authorized under their current regulatory plan. So essentially what this means is most of the change you're gonna see between the baseline, going back to the baseline here and moving on to the maximum allowable subsidence, or maximum allowable groundwater use scenario is most of that increase is here in Galveston and southern Harris County, and that's because that area one, you've had a lot of users historically over-convert. Again, that difference between the 3% and the 10% full, that's fully allowable. So overall, subsidence does increase by about a quarter foot to about half a foot across a lot of that area. In Galveston County, you see a little bit more. You can see generally between 3/4 of a foot or a little bit more in Galveston County. So again, that scenario for the most part has the greatest effects in area one. Now we move on to the drought scenario. And again, this is just simulates what are the impacts if you have a long, prolonged drought here in Harris County and Houston area and Galveston County. And the result is more or less, there's not much of a result in this scenario as it was designed. And you see, essentially the reason you see that is because even though the scenario incorporates periods of greater pumping in response to drought, the wetter periods of less pumping do balance out the subsidence potential in the periods of greater pumping. So more or less, the overall projected subsidence is pretty much the same. And again, this does confirm that also the regulatory plan is functioning as intended. The last one I want to talk about is the 5-year delay results. So again, this is if those entities delayed in North Harris County Central and West Harris County Regional delayed their conversion by 5 years. So overall, you see greater subsidence in HGSD regulatory area 3 up here in this area. You see those contours kind of come together a little bit more. You see a kind of grid, a half-foot contour grows all the way around central, northern to northwestern Harris County. And again, that's because most of the impacts are there from the due to delay conversion in HGSD area. Other than that, I mean, you see about another quarter foot, a half foot of subsidence in most periods. So you have to summarize all these results in just a single slide. You see as much as an additional foot of subsidence in Harris County and northern Harris County in particular, although most locations generally see about a quarter foot to about half a foot of subsidence. And then in Galveston County, you generally see an additional quarter foot of subsidence more or less. And then in the outlying areas, Western Liberty, Chambers County, and then you see up to about 9 inches. Again, with most of those areas, about half a foot. Then in Montgomery County, you have the greatest impacts there. You see as much as a foot and a half. So with that said, I'm going to turn things back over to Jason to.
Mike, what were we trying to standardize on as a good marker for annual subsidence rate allowable?
So I think we've kind of settled on the 5 millimeters per year.
5 millimeters per year.
Was it's the green dot that we have on our maps. And then I think that as we look forward and look at the monitoring data as it relates to the implementation of the regulatory plan, you know, when we get into that range where we're, you know, a half a centimeter, you know, that's going to give us direction to begin looking in those areas. And when we're over that 1 centimeter value, that's going to be something that we're going to have to look at very closely. I think one thing we'll talk about here in a minute is that one of the things, there are several things that fall out of this review, but for Harris-Galveston in particular, we have groundwater reduction plans and aggregate permits throughout our system. And although that aggregate permit may off those values that we think are acceptable. And in that case, we may have to go in there and look at those GRPs more intently. A great example of that is City of Katy,
Yeah, so that basically over 25 years is 5 inches.
25 years.
5 inches, so again, we had areas that are way higher than that standard.
We do, so the regulatory plan works. Regulatory plan's, gonna work, at least based on the tools that we have today. The big unknown for that right there is the impact of, further development and particularly groundwater development adjacent to Harris County.
Yeah.
Do we receive any input from the general population of people out in this area that say, yes, I'm okay with that amount of subsidence, or no, I'm not okay,
Yeah, so I haven't gotten that input from folks. In most cases, I get the input that subsidence is something that we're concerned about. So I haven't gotten input from anybody saying that, well, we're okay with half a foot over a given number of years.
All right, any questions about the?
So where are we going next? Cause I got some questions about where we've already been. Is that
And I'm
what
gonna ask,
we're
I'll go ahead and ask my.
So, were there any surprises? Did something pop up that was like, wow, I didn't really see that coming from where we started?
I would say overall, where you expect to see a lot of subsidence, we did, and where you didn't expect it, we didn't get a ton. So I would say overall, the results were fairly consistent when you look at where we added additional pumping in the model in those areas. I would say overall, it looked fairly consistent.
Okay, so let's go to the end. Looking back, were there any weaknesses that you identified in the process that you said, man, if we had that to do over again, we would have gotten more data, gotten different data, anything like that?
Jason, I'll give you a chance to step in on the pre-modeling stuff.
Sure. No. So a whole lot of that was on our end. I would say we took a, somewhat of a, varied path getting where we did, and a lot of that was because of what we learned along the way. For instance, when we set off on the population demand projections task, we were going in not knowing exactly what to expect coming out of the 2020 census and what that would mean. We had a lot of workaround plans, and we could use some of those we tested out, but it was a little bit of trial and error working between us and University of Houston to navigate some of those challenges and get to where we ended up. So part of that trial and error and fixing occurred in the process. Okay.
And then I don't know if this is where you're going next, but so we do another one of these in another 5 years, is that right?
Yeah, I think that's probably something we'll need to discuss because, we still have one more timeline, in area 3. So if we wanted to have anything that would inform that, we probably want to get on that sooner rather than 10 years from now, right?
Right, so I guess we'd be interested in knowing if we're starting here going forward, what additional data or what else should we do to fine tune what you've already done? And is that part of where this is going next? Okay, well then I have one other question. Did you guys look at, eliminating waste as part of this? Cause I don't really see that, and that's one thing that's really irritated me since I've been on the board, is that we kind of talk about all this water that gets wasted. That's the most expensive water we're talking about, right? I mean, it's already been pumped, or it's already been pulled out of surface, it's already been treated. I mean, if we stop that seems like there's a lot of water. Now, you may tell me at the end of the day, it's de minimis, I don't know. But did you guys look at that, or how would we look at that to begin to get a handle? Because I think there's some of these people that are coming to us, and that's a big problem. And we only have so much money, but it looks like to me the technology is really developed to be able to identify leaks. The big challenge is who pays to fix the leaks, right? And so I'd like for us to look at some sort of a carrot and stick on this idea of people just year after year after year wasting, 35% of the water, whatever. So
That's a great question, and to take those last two questions together there, I'll just preface that with, coming out of the study, what we've got is a very powerful tool, essentially, in both the long-term projections that were developed for the study and also the groundwater model. So it gives us a lot of flexibility in some of these things test. On top of that, those per capita demands we talked about, on top of developing those on a utility by utility basis, we've also got what went into the drought study, which shows, you know, what happens over time, dry years, wet years. We got a very high level of information that can be used. And so with that, that's my whole setup to say there are a lot of those scenarios like that can be tested. So we have that data that's on water loss that rolls up to the state. That's something that could be considered as a what-if scenario for y'all to test out.
Well, it really is a whole separate water source. We're sort of not accounting for.
Exactly, and so everything that we have here includes the current level of water loss, you know, generally the current per capita, of course, you know, that gives us the ability to run conservation scenarios, water loss reduction scenarios. There's a lot of flexibility in what can be done, so if y'all can imagine it, I think we've got the resources here to be able to test those things out.
Thanks, go ahead.
Just from experience, when we, a couple years ago, we looked at the same thing about water loss as a big cost to the city. And, we put in the city manager's, review every year about water loss. We went from about 15% water loss to below 5% in a matter of 3 years. It's easy, it's doable. Most of the systems are set up to measure what's necessary now. So there is a small model, as small as League City, but there is some data out there to prove that it does pay and you can save a lot of water.
That, you need to remember that it's not water loss that the utilities are reporting, it's accounted for and unaccounted for water. You can account for a lot of water, but it's still wasted, so you gotta take that into consideration too. A lot of water loss as well, the firemen went out and played for Tuesday night, or, you know, for whatever reason, we had to flush this area and we lost this much water. That's accountable water or unaccountable water, so the water loss is not just wasted water.
We were only measuring water loss from the system. That's all we care about, water leaks and, yeah, we're gonna have the cost of doing business with the fire department and running their hoses.
What I was pointing out is the data that they have access to is that data that's reported to the state, and that is unaccounted water and accounted water. It's not water loss. That's not what we report.
So you're saying paid for and unpaid for, is that?
No, it's accounting for all the water. Obviously, most of it's accounted for through a meter, or it's not. If it goes through the meter, you accounted for it. Anything that doesn't go through the meter, but you produced it, you can't figure out where it went, that's unaccounted water. It's not necessarily lost, it's just unaccounted for.
Okay. So the loss is
It's just two different
right, the
things.
loss is gonna be in the accounting water that we're trying to figure out, right?
No, the loss would be in the unaccounted. What,
Your main water main breaks, it's not going to the meter.
yeah, what they were talking about earlier was, or what you were talking about actually was, wasted water. Well, wasted water is not the same as accounted, or unaccounted for water. They're two different.
Right, but is the wasted water in the accounting for? Not all of it, some of it's in the unaccounted for?
It would probably be in both.
Okay,
It would be in both.
There's an estimate of real losses that's included in those numbers, and that's probably the best place to start from. It's not perfect, but it's at least a little bit of a
Yeah.
start, and that's typically we look at when we're looking at regionally, on the water supply.
And I guess what I would just like to clarify, this is a good discussion, I'd like to clarify it, and that, I think where you were going was for, water that's been pumped or treated, that ultimately isn't used, right? And it gets lost somewhere, whether it gets lost through a fireman,
It's unaccounted for.
It's unaccounted for, so that was the water that you were referring to, right?
And in our system, we're closed, so we literally account for every gallon of water coming into the system. We don't.
And if you have a line break, you don't account for that. If you have a
Well,
fire.
no, within our system, we did. We also, from,
But if you have a break, there's no way to meter that water to, it's pumped into the system, you can't pump the loss of that. If it goes to a fire hydrant, if firemen, they use it to put a fire out, they're not putting a meter on first to measure how much water they're using to put a fire.
And that's not the only use.
That's an example of that. But it's not-
putting the fire out, it's not a waste of water.
So I agree, that's definitely accountable versus unaccountable. So back to Kyle's point, I certainly think we can take advocacy to relatively, to basically it's just conservation, right, of the resource.
It's a place to start.
Yeah, Texas Water Development Board also looks at this on your per capita usage, which accounts for all water produced, when they determine the financial viability of some of the programs they give you. So they're encouraging you to be mindful of the per capita usage, which drives the financial accountability to do that. So I think it's a great way to do that. I mean, some people, 12%, 14%, you know, maybe good, if that was 5% fantastic, you could go do that. It really just depends on where you are on that. I think we can do something more than that, but getting the dollars to do this, oh my gosh, it's really hard. Everybody sees the breaks and the leaks, but there's a lot more water that's, you know, unaccounted for that really does happen.
Yes.
I have a question. When I look at this report here, the amount of subsidence in certain given areas, certain years, also looking at the population projection of the increased population, Harris County, Galveston County, et cetera, around here. And in my mind, it came up a question that I think should be addressed, is the economic impact of the subsidence to the individual. Because if I buy a house in Katy and it's gonna sink 6 inches in the next 10 years or 12 years, I'm gonna have foundation problems, I'm gonna have structural problems, so have you done any work about putting the after effects, money-wise, on the subsidence?
The Spring Creek report that's gonna get issued documents a lot of those unintended costs for the region, and as soon as we can announce that, I think that'll be a start of the economics associated with this thing. I mean, some of the data is mind-boggling. Look at it. I mean, when you're looking at 18 inches of subsidence over 25 years in some of those areas, holy mackerel, relative to do that. So I think it's very positive on that. But I like the concept, Kyle, if we come up with something to incentivize people looking at their leaks. Now, leaks did this innovative like LiDAR thing to figure out what the leaks were and all those fun things. Fantastic, but the dollars associated with catching up on that are really big. You could do that. Especially because a lot of leaks are small 1 inch, and you know, what's the analysis, like a 1 inch leak can do like 1 million gallons a month. It's some massive number of them, it's a small leak, right?
Is there any way to tie together the impacts of subsidence with sea level rise?
All of these things, I think if you look at a comprehensive look, there's probably dozens of different elements that you could look at, sea level rise being one of those. I would think that would, from my coastal impacts perspective, would be probably one of the, I'd say, easy, maybe too strong of a word there, but one of the easier ones to get a handle on of what that coastal flooding impact might be. So absolutely, that would be part of that overall study.
Yeah, Don, you just balanced the desal with the sea rise.
You know, you're bringing out this report. When it comes out, are we gonna be distributing it to all the municipalities, various districts?
I think Mike and Casey are itching to get this thing out. We're just waiting for the whole FEMA map next issue that they mentioned to get resolved. To go do that. But again, it's a good data point that shows you the impacts of subsidence on the region. Because it's not just, if everything's subsided at the same level, you wouldn't have some of these issues. But you have differential settlement, differential subsidence, which I think is what's causing some of these issues that we're looking at.
What happens if Washington gets rid of FEMA?
Relative to what?
It was like I mentioned before, we figured a solution around that problem, so we're okay. We're moving forward without map next, and we're fine.
Yeah.
To your point, Mr. Alcorn, I think it's a great question. I think a lot of times we get focused on the flooding side of this, and certainly that's the one that's most impactful. We see it on, CNN or wherever, but there's other pieces of the impact that have economic impact when it comes to subsidence. Historically, we've seen impact to wells, whether it be the wells cavitating and failing, screens collapsing, having to be drilled deeper, or having to drill into poorer quality water. That's a problem. We've had seawater, we've had saltwater intrusion in the past. That's a problem. The differential subsidence can impact outflows from wastewater treatment plants. That's a problem. It can impact property and that differential like you talked about. So we're actually working right now to develop a scope of work that would allow us to then look at that piece of it. Flooding is primarily what we see, but there's other pieces to this. I just had a conversation with a member of the public via email yesterday that was talking about the impact of subsidence on water lines, the water line breakage, in Southern Montgomery County. So,
Well,
it's out there.
Give you a good example, drive up 1960 and look at some of the older subdivisions right off of 1960 near Humboldt. Don't look at the front of their house, look at the side of it, you can see a crack where the foundation had settled. And, these are moderate income houses, they're not gonna put $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 to re-stabilize the foundation, some of them will, but subsidence is causing this house to crack and this one down the street here to crack because of, and just look through some of the older subdivisions, even up close to where you live, the woodlands up there, and you'll see the same thing. Like I say, don't look at the front of the house, the side of the house is a solid sheet of brick, and it's got a big crack coming down it. And the only reason it's cracked is the foundation is settled, and right at the foundation settled, it didn't have some.
Well, I mean, Jason's gonna go over some of the findings, potential next steps, but, you know, ultimately, what fell out of the part of the review, that we have external drivers that we need to be watching very closely. We know the regulatory plan, as stated right now, is gonna get us to where we wanna be in the short term. There may be more things we have to do long term, and looking at demand management moving forward, I think is something that we're gonna have to be, focused on, which is why our water conservation program is so important.
Sure. You know, this is a great conversation because it's a perfect lead into, you know, where do we go next? Y'all are already thinking and heading in the right direction based on some of what came out of the study. Obviously, like Mike said, the key focus of the study was, does the regulatory plan work? Does it achieve the goals you want? That is affirmed. So that's in itself is very strong, but also it points towards some of these things we're talking about right now. Of where do you take study beyond that? One of those items that was identified is really looking at the various credit programs for the districts. Those have been in place for some time. They incentivize good actions on the part of your regulatory community. That isn't always penciled into the math on the backside of what does that impact on subsidence. As you're providing that incentive, does it achieve the goals that you want it to? And so that would be a potential study in the future. The other one that y'all already started to embark on is looking at these areas that historically have been underconverted. Primarily, I'm talking about northeastern Harris County. As y'all reiterated today, that study's been recently kicked off, and so y'all already headed down the road on that to look at what are alternative water supplies for those areas, how can they economically be converted, and then what is that positive benefit to bringing them into compliance with the regulatory plan. And then finally, that last item really speaks to what we've been discussing these past few minutes is all the potential impacts of subsidence. If you could actually quantify what that is, we already know they're substantial. The Spring Creek study gives you a hint of what primarily the flood benefits are of preventing subsidence. But if you look at everything across the board, what does that look like? It's a very diverse scope ultimately that will come out of that, I'm sure, to cover as many of those aspects as possible. But these are all really good questions to answer. It definitely gives you all a very strong position for arguing the need for the regulatory plans and y'all's overall mission to protect the region. Any questions?
Thanks, Jason.
Thank you all.
Thank
So,
you.
so a quick question, this may really be for Mike. So what we got here, is sort of an executive summary that presents the results of various studies that we've done over the course of the last year or two or three.
Several years, for sure.
So, how are we making that information available?
Right. So all of the final reports that are final stamped have been put on the JRPR, Regulatory Review website. That includes the determination of alternative water supplies done by KID and Subsidence, the population and per capita water demand, the USGS groundwater flow model. The only other report that has not been posted yet, that will be posted at the end of the month, is the final technical report on the evaluation of the scenarios. And that is in the final stages of draft. The Fort Bend district will be doing their workshop at the end of this month, and once both boards have done their workshop, then that'll be available, will be posted. And then ultimately, as all that information's out there, and you have it listed in your resources on the memo, which ones are available on the website right now. then at the July board meeting, the current plan is to have that available for board to accept, the final reports associated with, this effort. And then, and then begin the path moving forward to the next regulatory plan. We've already started that with the Northeast alternative water availability study. And there'll be other studies coming down that begin to feed in some of the things that we identified through this study. One of the values of these types of reviews is that we learn what we know, we also learn what we don't know. And it gives us an opportunity to fill in those blanks and begin trying to fill in those things that we don't have a lot of information on. And Northeast Harris is one of those. I think that looking at the external drivers is another one. And then as we move forward, we're going to see additional work by the district that it really focuses on this demand issue, on water management issues and what we can do to support our water providers in the region in improving that. I think, but July is gonna be the meeting where we have the reports available for board acceptance, and they're all available to listen.
I think that was a very good question, and I want to chime in just a little bit, because I think either the administrative committee or maybe the science committee needs to talk a little bit about making this information available to the public in a way which would be easy for them to get at and see and understand. You know, we go to these water conventions, and you always see in the back of the room two professional cameras back there recording everything, and then they put it in a video. I think it might behoove us, and that's what I said, the two committees might want to talk about buying a camera. They don't cost that much. I mean, it's not cost prohibitive. And video, make sure you video this. Bring it back, and we probably need a special workstation that can process that film. Somebody may need to go to a few classes on how to do the video editing and put all that together and produce it, and then put it out on the web and really push this stuff and make it easy for people to see that when we do come up with restrictions out there, it's a carefully considered process. I mean, it's just not like, you know, just a snap. Oh yeah, let's make this rule and that rule. There's a lot of science and there's a lot of study that goes into it, and these are the reasons we do that. And here, we're gonna put it out so that anybody can see that. And I think that we need to focus on that. I'm sure Casey could get her hands around that pretty easily if we decided we wanted to do something like that.
Yeah, so we began that process several years ago, and one of the, you know, what you saw today from Jason was an executive summary of some really technical things, and even today, there was a lot of technical things in there. So, we know that we have we have a slew of incredibly technical documents that are being summed up in a little bit easier to understand language at the end in that comprehensive summary. But certainly we'll be working to develop ways to talk about that information to multiple audiences. And you know, we created a video a couple of years ago to kind of give the overall approach at a very high level. I do expect us to do more things like that as it relates to not only the review, but also some of the path forward and some of the science that we have coming out. Because some of the science that's gonna come out, the biggest challenge that we have, and I know you guys know this, is that the misinterpretation of the information that we gather. And that's the biggest challenge we have in communicating this type of information, is that can be easily misinterpreted. And it can be easily overblown. So we work very hard to make sure that we're putting things out in a reasonable manner, and we'll continue to do that. But I think having video and print and other things available to us, we'll have to use all those ways to get the message out. But we'll be using that, all vehicles available.
You know, when my wife was on the school board, she brought home a new term to me, edutainment. And that is, how do we present information in a way that will keep people's attention and get the message. And that's what I'm kind of trying to propose here a little bit, is that we come up with a way of putting videos together, you know, in kind of a professional setting that will interest people sit there and watch it, not just, you know, flip through it without really looking at it. It just happens if you just put a lot of data out there in front of you.
I feel we also need to focus our efforts, like where we can make the greater impact. For instance, like there is growth in, I think, 3 major counties, right? I think it's Montgomery, Harris, and another one, I can't remember.
It's
And
also
that is
some-
where the greater subsidence is, correct? Or do you know?
Those are some of the major drivers looking at those maps of where that growth is, where the anticipated potential groundwater uses.
Yeah.
Certainly.
So more than just providing, you know, the programs that we found, it's more of a guidance to